Welcome to Ask the Pastor with J.D. Greer. I'm your host, Matt Love. I am without Pastor J.D. Greer today because we are spending some time in a special series called Gospel and Politics. This series features some really great conversations between Pastor J.D. and other incredible guests who are just leaders and leading thinkers in various fields that we think are going to be really helpful for all of us who are trying to process and move through this election season. So this week shows an interview between Pastor J.D. and Ed Stetzer. So Ed Stetzer is a PhD. We're just locking in the PhDs right now. So Ed Stetzer is a PhD, and he's the dean of Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, and he's also the scholar in residence and teaching pastor at Mariners Church. And I didn't know this until I read his bio, but my new life goal is to be a scholar in residence. So that's what I'm now trying to work on. We'll see if this podcast helps me move towards that at all. But he has planted, revitalized, and pastored numerous churches. He has trained pastors and church planters on 6 continents, and he's earned 2 master's degrees and 2 doctorates. So the dude's smart. I train church planters. That's my day job, and some of the stuff that Ed Stetzer has written has been some of the most foundational elements of the training that we do. So today you're going to hear a conversation between JD and Ed centering primarily on the election itself and how we can engage politically with people that we may disagree with. So this is going to be a great episode, and we'll go ahead and dive in right now.
We are a church, and that means that our central role is to make disciples. We say to make disciples in Raleigh-Durham, where our church is located, and then around the world. And we are not a political organization, and so we always say that we're neither called nor competent to get into the finer details of policy, but we know that part of what it means to be a disciple is to learn to think Christianly about everything. I always think of the words of Abraham Kuyper, who said there's not one square inch of the entire cosmos over which Jesus does not declare mine. And that means tax policy, and it means how we think about gender-neutral bathrooms and how we think about healthcare and everything in between there. And so what we've done is we've got a series where we've got people that I would consider to be nationwide experts. Nationwide experts. And we decided to mix in one other person into this thing.
Couldn't find anyone
that,
else, and so here I am.
Which brings me to my friend Ed Stetzer.
Good to see you. I feel the friend.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Ed and I have actually been friends for a long time. His book, Comeback Churches, years ago, was one of the first things I read by him. Ed has also written hundreds of articles and is a guy that I really would say, that not only is just a friend, but just I look to on these kinds of subjects. There's frequently that we texting or talking, and I'll say, hey, how do you think about this? So, Ed, let me just start by asking this. At a recent lecture you did, I think it was back in the fall, you said something like this moment that feels so kind of like catastrophic for us. This moment should not pause the mission. Flesh that out. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we need to kind of acknowledge that the cultural moment feels different than prior cultural moments. You and I have been pastor for 30 plus years, and we've kind of come to the place where it feels different because it is different. And David Brooks wrote an article in The Atlantic that cited a Harvard researcher and another, I think, and kind of pointed out that every 60 years it appears that America goes through what he called a moral convulsion. And we had him in a class I was teaching, and in that conversation I kind of thought it's more than a moral convulsion. It's a cultural convulsion. And it's not just America. When I was teaching last year in the UK, I mean, the students are all experiencing this. You talk to people in the Philippines or Brazil. So we're in a unique cultural moment, and yet it's 2,000 years of church history. This is not the worst it has been for Christians over 2,000 years, but it is different. Yeah. So I think for us to acknowledge that there's a difference in the cultural moment, and that Christians, in some ways, it's difference in culture. We've lost our home field advantage. In some ways, it's a different in churches. Like they're not quite sure how to navigate. But for me, a guiding passage for me is John 20:21. Jesus said, "As the Father has sent me, even so I'm sending you." So I want to say to churches, 2024, I think is going to be one of the most challenging years in our lifetime. And in 2025, we're still going to be together on mission as followers of Jesus if we make right choices and take right approaches in 2024. So I'm convinced that the moment we're in does not pause the mission we're on.
So how does so you're plenty old enough to know this. I'm, from what base you've told me about this, but it does seem like in the last 20 or 30 years that political engagement by Christians has shifted and the tone has shifted. It's not like we were all like unified back then, but how is that, how would you describe the moment now compared to what it was even 10, 15 years ago?
Well, I think part of it is too, you got to define some terms. So you said Christians, and Christian people identify as Christians often have different political beliefs. African-American Christians have different political beliefs. In general, you can't say every person, but in general, than perhaps white evangelical Christians or white Rust Belt Catholics or whatever else it may be. So Christians have had a sense that maybe, and you're right, let's talk about something you weren't old enough to be at. We're about, a little less than 10 years apart. But I was there in Promise Keepers when Coach McCartney had this big gathering on the Washington Mall, and 1 million men went there. And it was a powerful moment. And Coach McCartney got up and said, listen, if you're Democrat or you're Republican or you're independent, we're all in this together for Jesus. And he talked about racial reconciliation and more. I would say to you that you'd have a hard time saying that sentence in 2024 as a pastor or a church leader. And I think, too, in some ways the political parties have changed, but also in some ways the way Christians view political engagement has changed. And I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out their way and their path to do that. And I think right now this is the conversation at churches. The most common topic I'm asked to speak on today is how do I lead our church to navigate political tensions in 2024?
So there's an old Scottish proverb that says for every 1 mile of road, there are 2 miles of ditch. When it comes to coaching, Christians that really are committed to Christ and would say that the Great Commission is, and we're gospel above all, what would you say are the things they've got to avoid and the ways that they could go wrong in this political moment?
Yeah, so in secular culture, particularly in more progressive parts of the world, what they would like to say is to Christians, just leave all that to yourself. It's fine if you want to believe those things, but just leave all that to yourself. But the reality is, I think that's one of the ditches.
Like, don't bring your Christianity into
exactly. Now, then the question is in what way? See, the problem is people say, are you political? Is that political? Well, I'm deeply concerned about life in the womb. I'm deeply concerned about the unborn. So are there political dimensions to that? Of course. I think ultimately Christians would hold a pro-life view and a pro-life ethic and advocate for laws that protect the unborn, just as we would advocate for laws that protect the marginalized in any context. So the challenge is some people on a more progressive side will say, well, just leave all that behind because it's too political. And I would say that one of the dangers is to basically neutralize yourself and say, well, I'm just going to be neutral on all these issues, when the reality is many of the biblical teachings that we hold to be true have political ramifications or expressions.
So let me stop you there, because you got more to say.
Yeah.
What would you say to the pastor, the Christian who says, look, I get it. The Bible makes me pro-life. Yeah. I'm pro-marriage. But I don't really ever want to talk about those things because I don't want to be controversial, and that would distract from the gospel.
Totally. And I would think that was something that you heard a lot of churches say in what we might call the seeker movement. And again, a little older than both of us in this case, but we're recording this in Southern California. Some of the day
after Super Tuesday, by the way.
The day after Super Tuesday, right. And but lots of churches say we're going to kind of stay back from some of these controversial issues. And I would say, I just don't think you can hide out in the basement and wait for this cultural storm to pass. So I do think language that we like to use in the places where I teach is clarity is kindness. So to be clear on what we believe, and I think that includes issues that have political ramifications, increasingly political ramifications. Let's go back to Coach McCartney's day, 30 years ago. And, when the reality was, when you said something like that, everyone sort of agreed that marriage was between a man and a woman. It was actually people are surprised that the Saddleback Civil Forum of Barack Obama, when asked by Rick Warren, said, I believe marriage is between a man and a woman because that's what the Bible teaches. I'm paraphrasing.
Right.
You tell people that today, they're shocked that that's actually the case.
Right.
So that was the consensus 20 plus years ago, less than that in some cases. So I think the times have changed. So now, when I speak up on some of these issues, it does become a sense of, well, are we getting political? And I would say we're getting biblical, and there are certain biblical positions that have political ramifications, and the political parties themselves have shifted on some of those issues in a way that I think Christians obviously see and are responding accordingly. So I do think for us, the cultural moment we're in is that I want to teach with biblical clarity on issues like the unborn, on issues like marriage, on issues like what the Bible teaches about race, and issues about where people end up being marginalized. And I want to speak about how we speak about immigrants and refugees and people made in the image of God,
and
worthy
systems
of
can embody injustice over
if
generations.
if we're individual sinners and we get together in systems and processes, we would expect some of that to be systemic as well. So I think that, and the Bible does. I mean, Isaiah writes about housing, approaches to housing in the Old Testament, and what's just and unjust. So I would say for us, let's teach what the Bible teaches, and it will indeed critique left and right. But it's also worth noting that it doesn't mean that these things are equal. It doesn't mean that these things are weighted equally. For me, again, your listeners and viewers may have different view. For me, I weight the character of a political leader. That's a key thing for me. I weight issues of the unborn. I weight issues of how they speak of other people, and the least of these, the poor, immigrants, refugees, and more. I weight issues right now of religious liberty, of sexuality and gender. I weight issues of how we deal now with poverty and more. And in the midst of all that, you started out by talking about tax rates. So, and we should care about tax rates, but I will tell you that in my understanding, I've looked to the Bible really closely. Jesus doesn't give us a preferred marginal tax rate. So as a pastor and church leader, now mind you, more than pastor and church leaders are watching this because this is for your church, but as a pastor and church leader, I spend more time on those issues. I'm willing to bet you haven't talked about the tax rates in North Carolina and nationally. And I'm in California, and I haven't talked about it in a Bible study. I have opinions on it, and I think, my guess is our opinions might be similar. But the church role, I want to deal with biblical issues. Many of those have political ramifications, and I think that's the lane that I'm primarily in. So back to your ditches, right? The Scottish proverb, ditch on one side is just be neutral. And I don't think that that's the case to be in 2024. But I tell you, when you're not neutral, people are going to get frustrated. So if I talk about how we speak, now I think Christians can have legitimate differences about border policy, about levels of immigration, about unrestrained immigration, right? I think those are good things Christians, but how we have that conversation really matters. And so I think that on the right-hand side of things, when you talk about issues that are in the Bible, like the kingdom of God, caring for the least of these, widows, orphans, and more, and you speak in that context of applying that to maybe the Samaritans of our day, who might indeed be immigrants, I think ultimately you'll hear from people on the right side. And I would say, don't be afraid to talk about what the Bible talks about strangers and sojourners, and to do it accurately. Don't read into 2,000-year-old text our current immigration debate, but it certainly does inform how we speak and care about other people as well. So those ditches, I think, are ultimately kind of two expressions of the same reality. I think let the Bible guide our conversation, but you will end up being seen by people on both sides of that if you let the Bible guide the conversation.
One of the things we like to say around our church is that there are straight line issues, which means there's a verse and there is a straight line between that and the policy or the conviction. Yeah. Then there are dotted line issues where it's the application. You may care about the poor. And but you may have a different strategy. So somebody else thinks more government involvement. We're like, let's just make sure we keep the straight line issues for what we reserve the thunder of the Lord for. What would you? I want to go back to something you said there at the very beginning, and you talked about character. Yeah. Now, I realize that this could be a really loaded conversation, and we'll refrain from saying that what we're going to say about this therefore means you should vote for or not vote for. Because I realize Christians can there's a lot of different things that go into a political calculus. But explain why character matters so much and why you wouldn't, somebody said, it really doesn't matter. All that matters is who they put in the court, who they put here. And that's all that matters. And their character is just, the King Cyrus argument. King Cyrus may be a bad individual, but, he can still do good things. Right.
And I can't imagine that in God's intent or design, he would want us as Christians to say, we'd like people of low character who get things done in office. And I think ultimately King Cyrus was, in God's sovereignty, God used, right? And we know that. In God's sovereignty, God can and does use people with low character in those places. And I'm of the view that, God lifts up leaders and puts them in place. And I think that sometimes people don't like it when you say that, God put this person in place, but if we believe God's sovereign and we believe heart of the Lord.
The heart of a king is in the hand of the Lord.
Thank you.
I'm your Bible guy.
Thank you. You are my Bible guy. Thank you. The heart of, I can't say it. That's what's funny. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. If we believe that, then part of that's we have to kind of acknowledge the sovereignty of God. But to the degree that I can, I want to seek out and encourage people of character. And by that is partly giving my vote. It might even be donating or volunteering, because if we work towards people of character being in office, then ultimately we'll see the kind of context, the kind of leadership that we want. And what I would say is a person who's not of character easily, it was Chuck Colson who once talked about how easy Chuck Colson, who was of Watergate fame, not everyone would know that name. I mean, he's been gone for a while. Prison fellowship. So Watergate fame, goes to prison, finds Jesus in prison. Jesus finds him in prison, changes him.
Come on now.
Thank you. I know. Theological correction, please. Thank you for that. Finds Christ finds him in prison, and then he leads prison fellowship. But he said once that Christian leaders were the easiest to kind of manipulate and fool. Bring them in the trappings of power. And I've seen, in a heartbreaking way, I've seen Christians get caught up in political power, not just on the right. I think when I say that, because people will say, well, I've seen that too. Well, but it's on the left and the right, where they end up really just get caught up in, like the writer of Paul in Galatians writes about how like they've been bewitched. And I want people to acknowledge, I know this is trite and cliche, but it's still worth saying because it's still true. Jesus is not coming back on a donkey, and he's not coming back on an elephant, and he's not riding in on Air Force One. So I think ultimately
our church thinks I invented all those phrases, so it's
is that
really
right?
bothering for them to come out of your mouth.
That's probably true. You've said that as well. But here's the thing, and again, it's simplistic, and we get it. But it's also true because some people get caught up too much in that. So what I would say is a person of character will not intentionally manipulate you. A person with low character will intentionally manipulate you. And I think ultimately what I've seen in both political parties is them attempt to manipulate people in ways that I think aren't glorifying to the Lord. And I think we should call that out.
Right.
And I think that's part of, I don't know if you've used this phrase before. It's not new with me. But I think we should be more like the umpire, calling balls and strikes and say, no, that's wrong. And again, part of the challenge having me on here is everyone can Google my name and all the major political people, and I've written on all of them. But I'm, deeply
and not as a pastor. You've done that as a Christian thought
that's an
leader.
important distinction. Important distinction. I was a cultural commentator. Now I'm in a little bit different role, so I do that less because I'm now leading an institution. But I've talked about some of the challenges in and around the way President Trump has spoken about immigrants and refugees. I think it's wrong. I think it's something Christians should call out and did. Or policies like the obsession that the Biden administration has had with abortion on demand and without restriction. I think ultimately we can say those things are wrong. I also don't weight those things the same, but I think we can say that those things are wrong. And as a cultural commentator, I have, again, less so now because I'm leading more of an institution, and I also just think ultimately that we've got to walk forward through this together. And I think ultimately part of my role is to help train pastors and church leaders to do that well.
So you've got a Christian who says, all right, the life and the marriage issues, what's happening with our children through the loss of gender and life stuff, that is so important to me right now that I just feel like that, that I don't want to say trumps everything, but that's the thing I got to vote for.
And can I just say, I know you want to frame that question a little more. I completely understand and think that's probably how most white evangelicals, use that as a demographic category. It's not like we're saying they're white and there's only, but that category is the view of the vast majority of people who are white evangelicals in America today. And I totally understand it. And I get where you get there, but you were going to say.
So I was going to say, and then you got another Christian who says, "Well, I believe those things, but I think character. I just think while you were talking, I was thinking about character matters. Sin, righteousness exalts a nation. Sins a reproach to any people. And this Christian says, well, I just feel like that is going to ultimately erode the foundations of our nation, and I don't care what's attached to it. I just feel like that is exalt. And I'm not saying either one of these is the right. But so they say, I'm just going to abstain. Then you get another Christian who says, I agree on the issues of, life and gender, but I just feel like the situation of such and such marginalized group in our country is so bad that I want to put my energy there. I know you, and I know that even of those three I laid out very simplistically, I know that your biblically informed wisdom would probably attract you personally to one of those three.
Sure.
But what would you say to Christians in terms of, should one of those be the Christian position? Should a church have room for different, and how do we engage on those if you've got people in the same small group that think those three different ways?
Well, I think the question is not, should that be okay? It's, what are we going to do now that it is?
Okay.
In other words, I would weight things differently than probably other people in some of those categories. And so, so for me, I would make this would be the direction that I would head. But the reality is, for example, if you have a multi-ethnic church, you actually are going to see differences among people of different ethnicities who come to different conclusions about how they weight some things. So I would be clear that in my context, I would weight certain things substantially higher than others. And
the political calculus.
For sure. I would say, so the question then is, so should people weight? I think you should weight some things higher than others. I think so. But I would say that we also live in a world where people are going to be in congregations together who differ. And back to our earlier conversation, I want us to still be a church in 2025. I want us to be a church that has not been afraid to speak up about the cultural moments, but the moment we're in doesn't pause the mission we're on. And so for us to walk through this together, we're going to have to acknowledge that people are going to come, if you use those three categories, okay? Yep. People are going to come to some of those three different categories. So what do you do? Now, what's happened in a lot of churches is they actually not been able to stay together. And so we've seen what I wrote about in Outreach Magazine in my editor's column, what I call the great sort. So people have sorted themselves out of their churches ideologically rather than theologically. You go back 50 years ago, you pick a church. If you were Lutheran, you go to a Lutheran church. Baptist, you go to Baptist church. 30 years ago, you picked out your church more on methodology. Was it contemporary? Is it, I want to be a gospel church, but different. But now what's happened is increasingly where people sorted themselves out theologically, your church would hold a high view of Scripture, would believe in inerrancy, would hold biblical views about
salvation by faith,
salvation by grace through faith alone. And people say, I want to be in a church like that. But what we've found is in the last few years, from 2020 forward, is that people have sort of said, no, I want to be in church that holds certain theological beliefs, but also is going to fight differently through the cultural situation that we're in. So what happens is often it becomes more ideologically driven rather than theologically driven. I think ultimately you can't, again, it's simplistic to separate those things, but I think it resonates with a lot of people that it feels like some of their relationships are broken, even among people that love the Lord, have the same high view of Scripture, salvation and gospel and more. And what I would say to you is, at the end of the day, I think we can do what the writer of Hebrews says, provoke one another to love and good deeds. Maybe not in your small group because you're talking about something else in your small group, but have the discussion with people who differ. And at the end of the day, recognize that you have more in common with your sister and brother in Christ than your ideological counterparts. Because, and so, too many Christians today are being discipled by their cable news choices, and they're being spiritually shaped by their social media. And the end result is, and it's hours a day. Like they go to your church and they hear you preach. Maybe they're in a small group. But if you're watching an hour a day and being discipled ideologically, it's hard also to go back and be in theological and Christian unity with people that may come to some different conclusions, to use those three categories you gave earlier.
Yeah, that idea that it's not as much theological likeness, but ideological likeness. You and I were just looking at a report together that talked about how there were certain people that identified as evangelical, even though they don't hold the evangelical convictions, because they think of it more as an ideology, a set of beliefs. Yeah,
so Pew actually did a study of that, and they found that over the last few years, and don't misunderstand, there's lots of evangelicals who hold evangelical beliefs, and I really care that we would identify as evangelicals with evangelical beliefs. So there's a research framework that the NAE uses that I helped develop when I was at Lifeway Research that has 4 questions. You strongly agree with them. Anyway, but what we found is people identify as evangelical. That's become more of a political term to people. And so you have people who don't have evangelical beliefs or not involved in church who still now increasingly the last few years have started using the term. So I think this is a big challenge, is that there are people in our churches who are like, well, what does it really mean if we use the term evangelical to describe ourselves? And some people saying maybe we shouldn't use it anymore. Maybe we should use Bible-believing Christian or gospel Christian. I'm kind of the view that's a very American way of thinking, because I'll be in Korea in a few months, and the evangelicals there will use the term, and they'll use it well, and they'll see it as a good thing. We can see that all around the world where that's ultimately the case. But in America, sometimes that has been identified in ways that are more political than theological. I want to get back to the theological. However, acknowledging that there are political ramifications, we're too far down the road as a culture to say that our theology doesn't have political ramifications because so many things are up for grabs today.
Right.
So many things are being questioned, foundational things about who are men and women, what is gender, and more. So what is life and more.
And a lot of the rights and freedoms that we enjoy and don't take for granted as Americans came from Christians who were getting involved in some ways to do that. So, you said in there that 2025, 2026, you want the church to be together and for the mission not to be paused. I can't help but thinking why you were saying that of something my financial broker told me one time. He said, stockbroker is like, he said the stock market is like a roller coaster. The only people who really get hurt are those who try to get off, in the middle.
Right.
And I keep thinking like, we're going to get through this moment politically unless we all decide to get off of the mission of the church and to get off, it's like even what you said at the beginning, like you go back and you look at, different times in American history where,
it's been way worse.
It's been way worse when people were killing each other's children. And that's a good reminder. So let me ask this. We'll kind of move. I want to ask you one question about your book at the end, but I want you to give some really practical advice, if you will. I want you to talk first really quickly, like 90 seconds, to the Christian who just finds himself leaning Republican, but obviously because of life and marriage issues, but also just when it comes to limited government and the best approach to empower the poor. What counsel would you give to them going into this election? And then I'm going to ask you to do that for the Christian who finds himself leaning left, not on issues of life and marriage, but leaning left in terms of bigger government, more regulation, that type of stuff.
Well, one of the things that we've found is that statistically, white evangelicals have moved more to the Republican Party because it aligns with some of the things you said. And these things also do tend to correlate together. I would caution in one sense, though. So, for example, I think that if you are pro-life and you are pro religious liberty, you're also probably pro Second Amendment. And you might also be pro lower taxes. And I would say to you that those are different categories and they correlate together in the way people think. But again, I do think those are different categories and ways to think. And for me, I prioritize them differently as well. Now, I live in California, so those things, none of those things are things that I get to probably even get to a vote on. So, but I do think so. Someone who sort of leans right. What I would say too is I would also ask the question if we're, not this leans right, but that's most white evangelicals, right? Mm-hmm. So what I would say is listen to how people speak of the least of these and the marginalized and push back when you see people speaking of people made in the image of God, worthy and dignity of respect with disgust and dismissive tones and words. And again, I think that's, in answer to your question, that's one area that I would do. I would also ask the question too, what public policies do I want to support that ultimately do interact with the most broken and the most marginalized? Because here's what I would, I'm moving out of even what I just said earlier, what I would talk about in church. But I would think we could look at the last few decades and say there's been just a huge failure in the Great Society and the approaches that followed out of that from the Johnson administration forward. So what is the path forward? What is the way to restore brokenness in communities and fatherlessness?
So rather than always being reactive, saying,
so what can we do?
Proactive,
What can we do? And I would say too that right now it's very difficult to do that because everyone has entrenched positions.
Yeah.
So what I would say is ask some questions and don't get caught up in the shibboleths. Shibboleths is an obscure Old Testament reference which people use in literary words today.
Thank you for explaining to me what shibboleth is.
I'm talking
condescend means to talk down to.
Condescend means to talk down to. Yes, it does. I was assuming that not everybody would be familiar with shibboleth. However, if you would like me to explain it, but the idea that you have to say things a certain way. So, for example, I'm not going to speak of people I disagree with in some of the ways I hear people on who may share ideological and political views with me. I'm not going to speak of people that way. And I think that's part of what we as Christians could say, that's where we're going to stand out and be different as well. So that's what I would say to people. Answer your question on the right.
Flip it. And those that were left for whatever reason.
Yeah. And I would say too, remember too, like I'll say something that might rile up some of the people. Again, I don't see anywhere in the Bible what the right marginal tax rate is. It's not, Second Opinions, chapter 4, verse 11 doesn't list.
Book of I Say So.
The Book of I Say So. None of that exists. So what I would say is, so if you want higher taxes because you think it's better for the care for the poor, if you want to cut defense spending, I get those things that might correlate together because what's happened in our country is now views sort of correlate together. But what I would say is this is an opportunity for you, if you're more on the left, to break some of that correlation, to have some courage about issues, and it's going to be hard because if you're talking about, man, I want to really care for brokenness, I want to care for, I want to work towards greater racial reconciliation. And I want to care that marriage is defined in a biblical way. And I want to say this is what gender is as well. So what I would say is it's hard. You're going to make people mad on the right when you speak up and say, we don't talk that way about other people. Or our policies. We want to ask questions about policies to help serve and minister to people. But it's also going to help people on the left, be harder on the left today because these things are all correlate together. So pretty much everybody who's pro-choice is going to also be more progressive on other issues as well. So you might find yourself, I'm with a group of people we want to speak up for better schools and better funding for education. You might find yourself with people who also have other views of social issues that you don't share. Be a person of courage on left and right, and call balls and strikes, to go back to what we said earlier. Don't say, I got to hold the same views as everyone else, because as Christians, we just can't and we don't.
So I'm not going to contradict what you said.
Please, but you're going to correct it.
No, I just want to add one thing that I think...
I'll probably agree with it.
Yeah, I'm assuming you would. There are Christians who would say, okay, I get it that it doesn't talk about a marginal tax rate, but how I understand human dignity, human responsibility, the principles of private property, that leads me to a more individual, free market, empowered, limited government. More of that approach. Now, and I realize that somebody else would say, well, what I believe about how sin gets institutionalized leads me to think that more government stuff is actually appropriate. In one sense, the person over here would say, it's my biblical convictions that's leading me here, even though this person here may come up with a different thing. I actually feel like we could affirm all three of those, and I could say, if I'm in this camp, I'm doing it for what I think are biblical wisdom issues, but it's a dotted line.
Well, I would say, I've always said, and then I heard you picking up from what I said, that there are straight line issues and there are dotted line issues. Actually, I've never heard that before. I actually like that, so I might start using that. But I would say, one of the things that I think might be helpful for us to learn too is from Christians around the world who maybe, like you mentioned, approach to private property, which again, here's the thing, like Bono, no less, said that entrepreneurial capitalism has lifted out of deep poverty billion plus people. So we know that this is so again, for me, I think that's better than alternative approaches, right? So I think we have significant evidence to say that.
Right.
That's not as much a theological case. So sometimes people do try to make it a theological case. Maybe a dotted line.
It's theological principles.
There's some principles.
But there can other be people and just say, what, I'm going to...
But I teach twice a year in the UK, and I work with the Christians there, and I'm teaching them in classes. And I got to tell you, they have a different view of the role of government. And
they'll fight you on the role of universal health care. I mean, these are that I share deep commonality with.
As Christians, and I'm kind of like, really? Because I'm like, I don't know. It's like...
we're not coming over here to get surgery.
I don't generally say that when I'm teaching a class in the UK, but thanks for that. That's a little advice I can use. So I would say too, I think, we want to think in terms of how have Christians responded in other times and other places as well. And I do think to have courage on the straight line issues, to have some maybe grace on some of the dotted line issues where we might disagree is helpful.
Let me give you the last word here. You're Christians in the age of outrage. Yeah. You've talked a lot about just civil discourse and why it's important. Let me just give you the last word here. What would you want us to go out on thinking about? Why did you write that book, and what are you hoping we get?
So I'll tell you a funny story. So it was 2016, and I was meeting. I had just signed a contract with a new publisher, Tyndale, and I was meeting in their offices, and they were talking about. I don't know if you do this. You probably already have all these books already written in your heart. But for me, I'm like, what should I write on? And we had a little whiteboard session. And they said, why don't you write a book on outrage? It was 2016, it was in 2016 election.
That's not relevant.
Yeah, everything was mad. So I said to them, because, it takes me about a year to write a book. I'm sure you're much faster. And then it goes through the whole process, editing, and it gets into bookstores back when we had bookstores. So I knew it would do 2 years. And so I said to them later, I'm not sure of that meeting, but in one of the meetings I said, I could write a book on outrage, but I'm not sure people are going to still be outraged in 2018. So clearly they read the cultural moment better, because right now Christians in the age of outrage is experiencing a renaissance.
Right, exactly.
But for me, part of what I wanted to write is, how do we not get caught up? And in 2016, 2017, 18, when I write this, I saw the beginning of what would almost become an industry of grievance and outrage. And what we found is it's all, like we mentioned cable news earlier. I mean, the reason they do that is you come back when you're mad. The reason that talk radio is that way is you listen because it makes you angry and feels like you got someone on your side.
It's your algorithm.
So it's your algorithm on social media, which is completely driven by that. Sometimes I will click on there to see some of the more outrageous things, and then the algorithm tracks you, and soon all I see is outrageous things, and you can get so caught up. And here's the thing: there are people in your church and mine who, when we say this, they're going to say, hey, I've seen some friends get lost down that rabbit hole. And they get lost down the rabbit hole of outrage because they end up in an echo chamber. I've mixed metaphors.
It's dark.
But it's a place. And again, as followers of Jesus Christ, it's an opportunity for us to say, we do hold biblical views that are outside of the mainstream of culture today. Culture doesn't know what to think of us. We can also live in such a way that we call balls and strikes in the cultural moment, but we can do so from people who, I have a chapter called Being a Winsome Ambassador. There's a bit of a war on winsome right now. Like, was winsome bad?
Oh, I'm aware.
Yeah, but I don't think winsome is a cultural strategy. I think it's the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so for us to engage as winsome ambassadors with all the stuff we've talked about here today, there are convictions and courage it's going to take. I think that's the way of Jesus. And I think the outrage ultimately leads to a dead end. The moment we're in doesn't pause the mission we're on. I want to be together with other followers of Jesus making a difference this year and beyond.
That's good. That's a good word to end on, because pulling up other people out of that rat and pulling ourselves up. Yeah. I think it was Chuck Colson who said this, but he said, every morning he reads the Bible and then the political headlines in the newspapers because he wants to see what both sides are up to. And, he wants to stay politically informed, but he doesn't want to live in that world. He wanted to live in the world of the Bible because we see a much more glorious mission that actually is, quite honestly, a lot brighter, even in the darkest of days. Amen. So, Ed Stetzer, thank you for being with us. Summit Church and our friends that listen. These conversations are hopefully to provoke you to think. There will be things that you hear that challenge you, things that resonate with you, things that make you say, I'm not sure about that. I hope in this is what they said of the Berean Christians in Acts 17, that you would search the scriptures and come up with something that is biblically informed. Probably no better way to end than on St. Augustine, or the quote attributed to St. Augustine, which he didn't actually say. In essentials, we got to have unity, straight line issues, and non-essentials, liberty, dotted line issues. In all things,
charity.
The age of outrage, charity.
Amen.
All right, well, thank you for listening. Next week, we're going to listen in on an interview between Pastor J.D. and a former NFL player, Ben Watson. It's a great conversation. Actually, a fun fact about a couple of these gospel and politics videos that you're watching, if you're watching on YouTube, is my wife, Lindsay, is a video producer, and she actually filmed and edited a few of these videos. So go check out her work. So don't miss an episode. Subscribe to the podcast. Listen on YouTube. Ask the Pastors on YouTube. Now, again, if you want to see my wife's amazing ability to film and edit videos, and you also want to watch these conversations that Pastor J.D. is having, go subscribe on YouTube at j.d.greer, and we'll see you next time on Ask the Pastor.